Welcome to season 6 of what is now called the Attaching to God podcast. We're going to be doing some more episodes of just Sid and I talking to each other about different topics. We'll still be interviewing people, and we're going to be, hopefully, we're going to be having a regular guest that will show up maybe monthly if we can
Ooh,
somehow,
mystery
the mystery
guest.
guest who maybe if we can get him to commit once a month.
Oh, you
And we're
just
also,
gave it away. It's a man.
it
You
is a
just
man,
said
it
it's a
is a man.
man.
And, we're also gonna be doing some concluding, like, regular bits at the end, which is called baggage claim, which you'll find out about that at the very end. But as per our regular introductions, we are Jeff and Sid Holzclaw. This is the Attaching to God podcast, where we are seeking to integrate neuroscience, spirituality, and faith. And as always, it is brought to you by Grassroots Christianity, which is seeking to grow faith for everyday people. All right. So here on the first episode of the new season, we could call this Jeff's second half life crisis
Okay, but
and why we're doing a name change. Okay. Yes.
before we even get into anything else, I just want to tell anybody who's listening that this was a really funny moment right before because
Sid saved the day.
yeah. So it's kind of funny because we have this pattern between the two of us that whenever I'm going to do something, including technology, I kind of go intuitively. I don't always pay attention to all the details. And so Jeff actually created a checklist for me once of all the things I needed to make sure I double checked before we started recording. And you know what happened today? We sit down and I just ask casually beforehand, "Did you make sure that the microphones are the sound input and not just the laptop?" And sure enough,
Sure enough, she saved the day. All the mic inputs were wrong and it would have sounded horrible. We would have talked for a half an hour or something like that. And it would have just been like, wow, 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 Charlie Brown.
so all that to say he's trained me so well
Yes,
that I follow the
save the day.
checklist.
And, this new season also, if you're watching online, on YouTube, this is I've decided to let my hair down, in the midst of this season, which means I'm wearing a hat because, as you know, I'm bald. Been shaving my head bald for almost 2 years or 3 years. Um,
And
but
how
I
many hats do you
but I
have?
that's a different question. So, I have quite a few hats, and I wear hats all the time, but on video or in classes, I'm not wearing a hat, but I decided, you know what? It's gonna be me. So, let's go through a brief history of this podcast. So when it got launched, we you and I had a podcast, a long time ago when I first
Like 5 years ago.
uh-oh, I got balloons. The Zoom balloons just went off again whenever I do the peace sign, I think. Anyhow, sorry about that if you're watching online. So, several years ago when our book came out, Does God Really Like Me? We did a podcast called God With Us, the God With Us podcast,
Right?
which we
We
did
did
many.
that down in the basement with horrible lighting and an awful
Yes.
backdrop.
And so that was our first, kind of podcast, and then about a year later, I launched a podcast just by myself where I was interviewing people. It was an excuse to get to know, new and interesting people, and then it was kind of like all about my, interest in neuroscience.
Was that one called Embodied Faith right away or was it
No, so
something
that one was
different?
called Being With. It was kind
Right.
of a play off of the God With Us podcast where we need to learn to be with God. How do we be with others? And how do we even learn to be with ourselves? And it was still kind of bringing in the neuroscience and spiritual formation. But then after a full year, I was also on the side, and this is where grassroots Christianity, like that name comes from. I was also doing these like theology courses, these online learning cohorts, where it was talking about 5 shifts of shifting out of like fundamentalism without losing your faith. And one of the shifts was to shift from a disembodied mind into an embodied faith. And I was working on the material and I was teaching through it a couple times. And all of a sudden I was like, that's a much better name that encapsulates what this podcast is all
I
about.
think I remembered you
Embodied.
coming in really
Yeah, I probably
excited and being
stormed
like,
in
"Yeah,
like,
what if we
oh,
called the podcast Embodied Faith?"
and you're like, "That makes sense to me." So we did that, and so it's been called that, ever since. We have some writings at another, site that we share together for our cohorts. That's called Embodied Faith. And so that had, we've been doing that for several years, and then last year we brought you on because we were stepping out, in, faith from our full-time ministry at, Vineyard, to now a much reduced part-time work there, but then also doing a bunch of other stuff together, you and I, as well as your coaching business. And so we brought you on, which is, I think, all the listeners agree that that was a stroke of genius by me. So they've loved having you. So thank you for being on for a full year. This is like an anniversary, I guess, for you.
I guess it is.
Anything you want to say on your 1 year anniversary of being on the podcast? Anything come to mind?
I'm really excited about the future direction of the podcast. It was fun last year, and I'm even more excited about this year. So I think it's gonna be a good season.
All right. So that brings us to this moment right now,
Yeah.
which is why are we renaming the podcast the Attaching to God podcast? Now, you know the results, but you actually don't know the pathway, you as in Cyd, but also all of you listeners. So we're going to talk about that to
Oh,
kind of
so
give
I
a
get to
little,
be surprised right
yes,
along with the listeners today.
or confused. It could be either because I don't know how
Just so everybody knows,
this
I
is going to
have
go.
no show notes for this. Jeff did not prep me for anything that we're talking about today, so I'm hearing it all with
That's
you.
right. All right. So I was talking with my spiritual director and a coach, even though you're a spiritual director and a coach, but since you're my wife and partner in work, I was figured that probably won't be good to get all that stuff mangled together or mixed up
Yeah,
or
it just doesn't always work so well when you try to coach or use spiritual direction with the spouse. Yeah, it's good to have somebody outside the marriage.
yes. So we are heading toward empty nesting, empty nest. Our kids are launching out of the world. It's really great. Our oldest son is getting married in a month, 2
Yeah,
months.
little more.
He's
Yeah,
also buying a house, blah, blah, blah. So these are all really great things, but it kinda got me into this place of like, well, what is God calling me into my next project or the continuing project? And maybe there's nothing, it's just like, but maybe there is something there. And I had the sense that either, I could continue focusing on the narrow, not in a bad way narrow, but like the narrow focus of embodied faith and the practical side of like spiritual formation and neuroscience, which I love to do. But this is kind of the more recent work uh, in the trajectory of my life. The broader work, which is a little older, which kind of goes under the umbrella of what is called grassroots Christianity, but also my teaching at Northern and Western and other places, is kind of the larger kind of just like I'm a systematic theologian who teaches theology and discipleship and church and missions. And so they're kind of like the broader side of theology. And so I was trying to discern like, do I pour myself exclusively into kind of like the neuroscience, spiritual formation, or is that just, or do I keep doing kind of the broader kind of systematic theology stuff or something like that? Does that make sense?
yeah, it makes sense to me.
So I had
Yeah,
a sense in which like I was trying to discern like, well, which one is it? Is it all this or is it all the other one? So I was trying to discern that. And uh, with the spiritual director or coach, they're kind of both the same thing, in this instance. Um,
they're not always the same thing, but in this
right.
instance, you
In
had
this
someone
instance
who is
was
both a spiritual director and a coach blending both together
right.
with you.
So he helped me see kind of a broader trajectory in which the most recent kind of neuroscience and spiritual formation stuff wasn't actually a big departure. So that's the story we want to tell. This is nodding yes.
Yeah, I'm nodding yes. And I just want to sort of add a little aside in that, the reason that the empty nesting sort of spurred on this question of what is my next project, is because I think you were really intentional about really being present and available as we were raising these young men to launch into the world. And so there were some things that you put on the back burner or put off to the side because you didn't want to be completely consumed by a project. And so I think in that sending off of like, we're launching our young men, there became this new openness to, oh, now I can be a little bit more invested in what my life's work is all about. So I just
Yeah,
wanted to sort of like add that
for
like
sure.
it felt like a new sort of launch point for you in a way too.
That is exactly right. All right. So the first thing would be all the Wayback Machine for Jeff Holsclaw. I was raised fundamentalist Christian in California, the Bay Area, Central California, San Jose.
You know what? Would it be helpful really quickly to just sort of say, like, for some listeners who might not know what you mean when you say fundamentalist, do you have a really quick sort of summary definition of what you mean when you say I was raised fundamentalist?
I was raised, yeah. Well, so this episode is going to be kind of jargony for some if you don't know all the church stuff, which is kind of inescapable. But fundamentalist for me would be Uh, Very high view of scripture, inerrancy, take scripture seriously. World missions was definitely a passion, as well as individual evangelism. It was also married to like conservative politics. Um, Very what is called dispensational or end of the world or rapture oriented, um, in kind of like the left behind kind of sense. Let's see what else would fundamentalism, um, very kind of militant in faith, and the way they hold their beliefs, very individualistic, as far as understanding salvation, non-sacramental, um, very personal, like me and Jesus kind of stuff.
Okay, thanks. I think that's helpful.
So I was raised that way. And it wasn't until I was probably like 17 where I learned that I had a brain, which was kind of a revelation.
What?
Yeah. It was like, "Oh, I like using my brain, I like thinking about things," and it was at that time that I discovered C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer, and their kind of apologetic arguments for the faith and the God who is not silent, and kind of the cosmological like, all the arguments for God's existence, as well as C.S. Lewis's kind of understanding of, beauty and, his arguments for morality. So that was like my first kind of understanding where faith, could be like intellectually defended rather than just like asserted kind of militantly, like the fundamentalisms that I was raised with. And then I went off to public university, public school, or a secular school, as us, fundamentalists would want to make clear. I didn't go to a Christian school. I went to a secular school.
Was that a conscious decision or was that a financial decision?
It was a little bit of both, I think. I had an early call to go into ministry. And I felt like I didn't wanna be sheltered in, like, my faith. That prompted me to get to study philosophy, which is, like, the first part of the story, where, because I felt like that would be a good background for theology for when I went to seminary for grad school. I had my whole life mapped out.
Which is why I thought you were much older than you were when I first met you, but that's a story for another time.
That's right. So so the main point for this first part is I was studying, postmodern philosophy, um, in college when I was, 17, 18, 19 to 20. And, I was pulling that into this kind of apologetic framework of Francis Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis and other people, in the sense that philosophy doesn't defeat faith or theology, but it can enrich it. It certainly does challenge it, but it doesn't defeat it. That there's ways to answer even really good and critical kind of understandings of philosophy. And so for me, like I took on, especially like the postmodern critique of faith, which we can't get into all like what is that critique, but I I kind of use it as a way to both defend faith, but it also helped me like leave my fundamentalism. So I kind of used it kind of gave me a path for recovering an ancient faith as faith seeking understanding, not a faith that's just like all certainty. We have all the answers, but is open to mystery but doesn't just lead to, a loss of faith or something like that. And so I'm usually, when it comes to philosophy, I'm usually a little too postmodern for my conservative friends. And I usually defend orthodoxy a little too much for my more progressive friends.
Which is why your Facebook feed is so
So interesting.
exciting.
Yes. So that was a kind of the high level. If we think of like philosophy as kind of like those grandiose ideas, I was starting kind of like at the top level with theology and philosophy. And then I went to seminary. And then, which is, lots of stories there. But then I also started getting more into like political theory or politics or how is the church itself its own like social political institution. And that was part of my coming out of fundamentalism is faith isn't just about individuals and their relationship to God, it's our relationship to one another and that actually our life together is the best witness to faith or rather is the best defense of the faith or we could say the church is the best apologetic, is what I kind of came to. So instead of the apologetics being this like realm of ideas, it's actually the lived life of the community that is the best apologetic. And I actually think that's why a lot of people are leaving the church right now. It's because that lived life of the
Yeah,
church
that's
is
true.
not witnessing to the goodness of God, which is, another kind of set of
And that
conversations.
was a pretty big shift for you from that sort of just me and Jesus all by myself um, life that you were raised with into this sense of like, no, actually, there is no life outside of this embodied witness of the community of God.
Right. And then that spiritual formation, or what we call discipleship, isn't just a one-on-one thing. It's something that happens communally and socially. So we could think of a Sunday morning worship service as communal spiritual formation. And so that
Mhm.
was something that, I was getting brought into, is that, the things we do with our bodies on a Sunday morning in community with other people shapes and forms our faith and our life together, um,
And we're
in
being
all sorts of
shaped
ways.
yeah, we're being shaped and formed on Sunday mornings even if we're not being intentional about how we're being shaped and formed. Like,
Right. And so even though the idea of like spiritual formation and kind of like that kind of discipline as we think of it now isn't something that was on the top of my mind, this idea of some sort of formative work happening
mhm.
in the church community was very much in mind. And so when I was getting my doctorate, I studied a lot of like political philosophy, especially there's this interesting trend about 15 years ago where atheist political theorists were kind of latching on to certain Christian views as like revolutionary kind of work.
Can I quickly insert how you got your doctorate? Is that like do we not have time for that?
No, that's a different story because it's not
Okay.
quick. So,
It's a good one.
it's
We'll
God's
get to it
work. Yeah, it was
eventually.
God's work that I got a doctorate. So, that helped me, so that kinda turned, so the first one was like, philosophy doesn't defeat faith. There was also this kind of idea that political theory, doesn't defeat faith too. So you can't just dismiss the church by, saying, "Oh, it's just one politics among many, or one kind of political institution among many." It can just be reducible to anthropology or social issues or something like that. And so I kind of started really getting a more robust, and this is another, deep topic, but the Anabaptist tradition of formation, of pacifism, of the community kind of working together, and it's especially its understanding of power, um, became like really central for me. But that was the idea that like political theory doesn't defeat faith either. It can enrich it and deepen it, but just engaging with politics doesn't just make faith peripheral or superfluous, to use the fancy word.
Okay, I do feel like it's important to at least mention that in that in between seminary and your doctorate, you worked at Starbucks for 3 years and you rode a bike through the snow to get there and back. And you spent a lot of time with your kids who were very small at that age. And I think that was a huge part of your formation as well, that it wasn't all happening in your head. It was also becoming a father. It was learning how to make yourself available to your stir crazy wife and your two little kids.
So you're saying I was being formed
Yeah,
myself a
you
little
were
bit?
being formed in that whole process, and I just wanna throw that in, especially for the people who are like, "Oh, is he just gonna talk about, like, heady stuff the entire time?"
Well, I would if you didn't
But I
interrupt.
think this parallel process of, like, you had all these ideas and, all these different things that you were reading that were shaping and forming you simultaneously as living a very ordinary life, serving customers coffee and dealing with, people on a like, you were living a
Right,
real life in the middle of all of this
right,
in the
right.
real world.
Yeah, so I'm not just like a professor that's in the ivory tower who reads and writes books or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that makes a big difference in how you see the world and how you speak
Well, and part of
about it.
everything you just said is what led into kind of this third shift then, which is into like neuroscience and psychology, because that was part of the path that was helping our marriage move forward.
Mhm.
How do we understand the skills for turning on our relational circuits and staying connected rather than slipping into protection, and
Helping
under,
you attune to our kids when they
helping
would get
attunement,
yeah.
implicit, explicit, and this was your journey quite a bit too. But I was, since we're together in this life,
Mhm.
we're journeying that together. And because I am such a researcher and primary source person, after some of these trainings and things, I was like, I want to learn more about this. This is
Yeah.
pretty interesting. So and that was 10 plus years ago, and and early kind of research led into our first book, but then I kind of kept going deeper into attachment theory and neuroscience. Um, as well as just psychological theories. And then, of course, there's like trauma and abuse, church trauma, church abuse. All that stuff is kind of like in in the mix now. Um, and going so, but there's also this trend, especially right now, where it's like the more psychology you learn or the more trauma informed you become, I see a lot of people who then is the less and less concerned or committed to faith you become, and the
Mhm.
more and more sometimes militant against faith. It's faith that has been abusive. It's the church that has been traumatizing. And I'm not saying that those realities
Yeah, I mean, we
aren't
can
true for people.
acknowledge that
Yeah,
those things do happen.
right. But it's not necessary that the more psychology you learn, some people feel like the more psychology you learn, the more you can demystify this thing called faith and find out that, it's not really, it's just us and our own psychological needs creating a religions as different coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms, and different needs are being fulfilled through religious communities. And on the one hand, like, well, that's kind of true, I guess, and that's not, but that doesn't mean you can dismiss all the
No,
other
I
realities
mean,
of
I think
faith.
I mean, God knows how he made us. He knows what our desires and our relational needs are. And so I don't know, is it such a bad thing that living in a community of faith when it's at its best actually does meet some of our basic human
No,
psychological needs?
I, I don't think it does. I think that's absolutely right. So for me, um, this kind of like third wave was kind of like, well, psychology can enrich faith. It doesn't defeat faith and theology, and it can't explain faith and theology away. Um, and so for me, like the path right now is something like, well, life with Jesus is the true therapy, or it is that which
Mm,
saves us, which is, and salvation is like a salve. It's the thing that heals us. Like that's actually the root of the word, right? Salvation. And so we're both, very in this podcast is very committed to the idea that like, God still saves and heals the wounds that we have. Um, and so when I was talking with my coach slash spiritual director, and we were kind of just outlining these like large movements, and there was other kind of tragedies and difficulties in my life about like I had like a back injury when I was in my late teens, and that kind of did certain
pretty
work.
significant back injury.
Yeah, very significant back injuries. So that did like significant work in my own life as far as emotional regulation, becoming aware. It was part of me becoming embodied, even though my fundamentalist and family life didn't really teach me how to be an embodied person. This injury did. And so I was
Yeah,
forced in this
you
path.
had to become aware of your body and what it needed and what you needed to do to take care of yourself.
Right.
Yeah,
Um, well before I had all these words and these shifts in the postmodern philosophy and the theology and the practice and the embodiment, all before all that stuff, I had kind of lived into it. So it was all those things that kind of left me to see that actually this apologetics thread, which is, a defense of the faith, or kind of a not a defense always sounds so defensive, but kind of like
mhm.
a giving of reasons for the faith that led through philosophy and politics to psychology was actually because it was actually kind of together. It was like one trajectory of that. I have a heart to make the faith kind of understandable on all sorts of different levels, and that is something that's important to me. And so I saw, oh, this is like works on multiple ways. So
Well, just
okay,
to
go ahead.
simplify, yeah, I think, we've often talked about how you read the books that people are not normally going to read because you love them, because they excite you, because you are interested. Like, this is a man who, in his leisure time, is reading things that are not leisurely for most people. And so just to say that, like, the work that you do, I think, has always been really important. And it's that sense of, I'm going to read all these. I mean, look at the books we're surrounded. We're in Jeff's office. We're facing each other, but we're not actually next to each other. But as we face each other, there's all these books that we're surrounded by. And they're books that I'm not going to choose to read in my spare time. But the way that you can distill them and integrate them and then present something different, I think has encouraged so many people in their faith throughout the years and in the different various contexts that we've been in and the cohorts that we've done. And so I love that your coach was able to point out, actually, this thing is very consistent with what the kind of work that you have always done. The flavor of that work is to integrate and make understandable things that are really pretty complex to integrate.
Well, I like it. It's fun. So all that kind of adds up to I started off with this initial like dichotomy, like, do I decide to just pursue embodied faith kind of more rigorously as like our partnership, you and I together, and kind of work on the spiritual formation stuff. But part of me was like, I like all that stuff, but there's that other side, the theology side, the more cultural engagement stuff. I find really, interesting and passionate as well as important. So after kind of looking at this kind of like big thread, um, large trajectory, I just felt like, what if I just continue to do both? And the theme of which is the theme of our next book, but the idea of attaching to God, I kinda came around to of like, well, actually, that is big enough to encompass all these
Mhm.
concerns. Like, practically, on the spiritual formation neuroscience side, obviously, the attachment theory, integrates those kind of disciplines. We've talked about that on this podcast, on my writings and things like
Not
that.
as much as we could. We're gonna
Well,
talk
we're going
more
to.
about it.
But then also on the systematic theology side or just theology or, scripture and how we read the Bible, there's a lot there, because attaching to God is just another way of saying like God's love for us and how is God's love displayed throughout the Bible? How is God's love displayed to us through the cross, atonement theory? How is God's love displayed through the church, ecclesiology? So it's all those classic kind of like topics in theology
And
that could still be
emphasizes the relational nature
right, right.
of salvation and life with God.
And so it's in a sense, it's not just this podcast that is kind of getting a name change. It's kind of like Jeff's whole kind of like life work is going to be under this umbrella of attaching to God. So there we go. That's the whole scoop of it in
And
26
why should
minutes.
listeners care? Like, why does it matter to anybody that there's been this shift? How will it help them read your Facebook
Oh, I don't
posts
know.
or
Because just
listen to the
knowing
podcast?
the inner machinations of Jeff Holzclaw is important. I don't is it
Machinations?
machinations? I
I
don't
don't
know.
know.
I say
It's
words wrong. That's who I am.
a man who wears hats.
Okay, so really yes. So that's why we're doing the name change. We will continue to be a podcast that's focused on a neuroscience informed spiritual formation, especially focused on attachment theory, but all sorts of things. We'll still continue to have guests. So in that sense, things aren't going to change a lot, but we're going to do more episodes where it's just the two of us.
And Jeff won't talk the whole time about really heady stuff.
No,
We'll have different kinds of
yeah, for
conversations.
sure.
So if you're listening to this episode and going, "Oh my goodness, I didn't even understand half of what he was saying." Don't worry, it's not always going to be like that. We're going to talk about his cold plunge adventures maybe.
No. So, although we're about to talk about that. So, another part of the change is we decided to have some regular, and we'll take suggestions
Oh,
if
we
anybody.
will we?
Well, I mean, we'll take suggestions. I don't know if we'll
That
do
are
it.
within reason.
So, but regular segments of things that are kind of like off the topic, but we always come to it. So Sid came up with this really good idea. Can you briefly explain the idea?
Yeah, well, it was just the idea that, like, we all have people like to talk about their baggage, right? The things that they end up carrying around and you bring with you even when you don't need it, right? It's just always there.
Especially
It's
into
this
relationships.
baggage, right? And so I talked about this idea of like check your baggage or like pick up, like when you go on a trip, you have to check some baggage because it won't come with you onto the plane. And so that idea of I mean, it goes under the you know what I mean, but it's like so I had that idea of, like, check your baggage, like, willingly release it, like, sort of talk about it,
That's not what we're
name it.
calling it, though.
No, because you changed it to
Oh,
something
okay.
even more clever, which was baggage claim.
I don't think I did. I think you did.
Oh, well, whatever.
So, yes, baggage
That's
claims.
how
So
ideas
we're
often
gonna
happen with
have
us. We
we're
don't
gonna
know.
have a regular segment called baggage claim where one of the 2 of us, or sometimes both of us, depending on the topic, are gonna claim our baggage in the relationship, as we saw it pop up either in the previous week or month or, maybe 10 minutes before we press
And we will not share
record.
with each other ahead of time
That's not true.
what the oh,
No, no. Just
okay.
this time.
Okay, well,
Just
you
this
didn't
time.
tell me today, so
So, this time I'm gonna do it this time. Baggage claim is going to be, I'm gonna do 2 really short ones, and then you can respond. You're gonna laugh.
just go respond in
And
between.
these are
You have
kind
to
of
wait
yeah,
till
yeah,
you've
we'll do
shared both.
yeah, and these are kind of, low-hanging fruit, so then we can work up to the much more personal stuff. But the first one is, I'm gonna claim the baggage of getting really passionate about random new things. Okay. So usually this is like books and research ideas, which are pretty innocuous and they're usually in line with all the stuff about this podcast, emotions, resilience. What the heck is this thing called psychoanalysis? Or I'll deep dive on Carl Jung for like a couple weeks or something like that. But more recently, I did the really passionate thing about mud water.
Yes, yes,
Yes,
you
I did.
did.
So, and I started off the mud I started off with the do it yourself version. This is like the
Mhm.
coffee substitute with mushrooms and then like, chai
Ordering
or
like a 2-pound bag of turmeric.
yes, so I got like bags of turmeric, cinnamon, mushroom powder, chai tea powder, and I don't know what else, right? And then I mixed it and I had this formula and I got it right for like a little bit, but then I made the big batch. Um, and I guess I screwed it all up and it tasted awful, was no good. So then of course I got over the passionate thing that I was passionate about.
And we still have a lot of that
And that
homemade
was like
mud
a
water
year
that
ago.
doesn't taste good.
But then someone else said, I think it was one of your clients, or I don't know what, you brought it up about the everyday dose mushroom latte thing. And I was like, I just ordered it impulsively, of course. And now I've semi faded on that, but now you're hooked on it. You're drinking it like every day.
It's true.
So, so then what's the other big, passionate thing that I'm passionate
The
about?
cold
The
plunge.
cold plunge. Yes. So
You
I know
talked
everybody's,
relentlessly about the cold plunge for a long time, and then you went to Facebook Marketplace and you bought yourself an old freezer and you got like a thing that regulates the temperature, and then you had to reseal it and seal it, and you actually stuck through a lot of hardship on that one.
yes. So
You did not give up quickly.
I made my do it yourself,
It wasn't like the bad
cold
batch of
plunge.
mud water that
No.
you chose not to try to fix. Like, you kept problem solving the cold plunge, and now it works even though it won't shut.
So I used a pond liner to, put inside the freezer to keep the water in from leaking, but then the freezer cold unit thing keeps it cold, although it doesn't need to because it's still super cold right here. So that's I'm just owning, I'm grabbing, I'm claiming the baggage of being passionate about random new things. The other one is I'm gonna claim, and you as my wife will know this already, but I'm a tough directee for spiritual
Hmm.
directors.
Which
I'm a
is
tough directee. I'm sure if any of you spiritual directors who are out there, you're like, "Oh, I have a couple of those." I hate talking about myself in general, which is a miracle that basically this entire episode was me talking about myself.
yes, but it's about your intellectual and
That is
academic
true. I know.
pursuits,
That's
so it's a it's a very safe
it's
way
like a
to talk
cheat.
about
It
yourself.
is. It's a cheat. So usually, I'm a tough directee because I give short answers. They're very precise and to the point. I do a lot of internal processing, which means I don't verbal process much. So I'm sure my spiritual directors like feel like I don't know what they feel like, but so anyways, I'm going to own that too. I'm a tough directee.
Yeah, those are good baggages to own, and I think it's great that you have that awareness about both of those things, and I love that you can claim those.
All right, so that is the Jeff Holsclaw's second half of Life Crisis and why we changed the name of the
Oh, we did
podcast
call it a second half of life crisis
just for this
now,
episode. It
just
wasn't
for
it's
this
not that's
episode.
just,
It's just that it's a
it's
jargon that
yeah,
people
that's
will.
clickbait. I didn't really have a crisis, but I was doing a discernment time.
You're doing a
So,
deep work,
that's right. So,
having
that
a
is what it is.
catharsis of sorts.
So moving forward, we're going to be Sid and I are brainstorming topics. Please, wherever you see this, whether it's Facebook, on the podcast, where we write, or on YouTube or wherever. If you have ideas of things you would love to hear us talk about, please drop that in the comments wherever you find it. And we'll be getting back to episodes just about one a week moving forward.
Yeah, good stuff.